All right, so today we're going to do something a little different. We're going beyond a simple history lesson to really look at how a historical story can be twisted, reframed, and even weaponized through satire. We're about to pull apart this really interesting and kind of provocative piece of online commentary that does exactly that.
They were settler colonialist babies. Rattles are just early-stage weapons of oppression. I mean, seriously, what kind of document actually says something like that? It's absurd, right? It's shocking, and it's the hook that pulls us right into a very specific and very strange argument. So let's find out where this comes from.
Okay, so the source we're digging into is called, get this, Marco's Definitive Notebook of Blame, TAM. Yeah, that title alone with the little trademark symbol kind of tells you we're not dealing with a dry history textbook, right? It's immediately setting itself up as something we need to analyze, a case study in a very particular way of arguing.
So first things first, we've got to get our heads around the premise here. This whole thing is satire. Its only goal is to make fun of a specific type of argument by pushing it to a ridiculous extreme. The idea it's mocking? It's this notion that you can blame the state of Israel, which wasn't even a thing yet, for violent stuff that happened to Jews before 1948.
So how does the author do this? Well, they don't just come out and state their point. They build this case example by example, and as you read, you start to see this clear, repeating pattern emerge. And that's exactly what we're going to follow.
Okay, so just to give you a little context, these are the historical events the notebook pulls from. Notice the dates, right? All of this takes place in Mandatory Palestine way before Israel was founded in 1948. We're talking about a period that stretches from the 1920s all the way through the 1940s. You get the picture.
All right, let's look at the first big example the notebook uses, the 1929 massacres in Hebron and Safed. And it's really important to know, these weren't like new settlements. We're talking about ancient Jewish communities, places where people had lived for literally centuries.
And boom! Here's the formula in action. On one side, you have the historical fact, just stated bluntly. On the other, you get this satirical explanation. The logic being mocked here is something the author calls anticipatory self-defense. It's a totally bonkers idea, right? That you can justify violence in the past because of something that might happen in the future.
So you can probably guess what happens next. The pattern just keeps going. The next example? The Arab Revolt from 1936 to 39. This was a really violent period. Widespread attacks against Jewish civilians, farms, buses, you name it.
And yup, here we go again, same exact formula. The fact is the violence of the revolt. The satirical explanation, well, it flips the whole narrative on its head. It takes Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis in Germany and reframes them not as people running for their lives, but as these provocative aggressors who are colonizing the region just by, surviving. It's a perfect, if chilling, example of victim blaming.
Okay, this last example the notebook uses is, well, it's maybe the most powerful one. It zeroes in on the attacks against Jewish Holocaust survivors when they started arriving in Palestine in the 1940s. Yeah, this one really hammers the point home, doesn't it? The plain fact is that people who had just barely survived an actual genocide were immediately met with more violence. And the sarcastic explanation? It just casually says, hey, this is a totally normal reaction. It perfectly highlights the absolute absurdity of blaming refugees for the attacks they're facing.
So after walking us through all these examples, laying out the pattern piece by piece, the author kind of pulls back the curtain. They give us what they call a meta note. And this is where all the satire, all the subtext suddenly becomes the main point loud and clear.
And this right here, this is the setup for the punchline of the entire piece. The author sums up the argument they've been tearing apart, this idea that everything, every single bit of violence before 1948 can be laid at the feet of an Israel that didn't exist yet. And if you believe that, they say, well, you're left with only two possible conclusions.
And this is just brilliant. This is the core thesis of the whole thing. The author gives you this ridiculous false choice. Option 1 is pure sci-fi nonsense. Time-traveling space lasers. I mean, come on. And option 2, that's the real point. Maybe, just maybe, the violence wasn't some complicated reaction to a country that didn't exist yet. Maybe it was just plain old anti-Semitism that didn't need an excuse. The satire forces you to see how much simpler the real explanation might be.
So, okay, what's the big picture here? What are we supposed to take away from all this? This whole piece, it's not really about just teaching history. It's like a masterclass in seeing the power of framing an argument and how narratives get built and twisted, especially in heated online debates.
You see, at the end of the day, this notebook isn't really a history lesson. It's using history as a tool.
The real topic here is rhetoric. It's a critique of a very specific way people argue online. And it's designed to help all of us spot when a historical story is being bent to fit a modern-day agenda.
So let's really break down the tactics this satire is putting a spotlight on. First, you've got reframing aggression as just context or self-defense. Then there's blaming victims just for existing or trying to survive. Third, there's anachronism. It's a fancy word, but all it means is blaming people in the past for something that happens in the future. And finally, you have completely flipping cause and effect to create the story you want. Honestly, being able to spot these tricks is a huge media literacy skill.
And all of this leaves us with one last, really critical question to think about. This whole satirical piece hinges on that word, context. It's the word the author uses over and over to mockingly justify violence. So the question we should be asking ourselves whenever we see arguments like this is pretty simple. When does context actually give us clarity? And when does it just become an excuse?